Cambridge Center has been doing place-based experiential learning for close to 150 years. And so today we continue this tradition of offering diverse classes in everything from culinary arts to visual arts, languages, literature, and so much more. And we also have the pleasure of hosting and programming these really interesting, important events around topics that are important to our community. And so you're here for the second installment of Conversations on the Edge, a new thought-provoking series for us. And as you know, today we'll be discussing resistance in context. Our panelists are experts in history, law, community organizing, and so much more. And with the help of our moderators, Zenon, Jora, and Wemeka, who is a digital reporter from WBUR, and we're so happy to have her here with us tonight, we're going to be discussing different acts, motivations, methods of resistance across time, and contexts. I just want to give you a few little notes before we begin this evening. First, shortly after this night, you'll receive an email with a link to an evaluation that you can share your feedback about your experiences here tonight, and so that you can help us improve this series as we go forward. The other note I have is that if you want to stay up to date on the next conversations in this series, you can go to ccae.org/conversations. You're also welcome to stay afterward for light snacks, refreshments. We'll have some wine where you can kind of continue the conversation that we hear here tonight. And lastly, many of you are donors, and many of you have given more than the suggested donation for tonight, and we thank you so much for your contribution. Here at CCAE, our tuition covers only 80% of our operating costs. So if you feel compelled to give, you do have a pamphlet on your seat that will give you more information on how you can help support really important programs like this to bring really awesome experts to speak to your community and get to enjoy this learning experience. So there's also an envelope. If you feel inspired to give tonight, you can send it along, or you can find a staff member at the end of the evening as well. So thank you again so much. I really look forward to learning alongside all of you tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to Zenon Jor, who's going to get us started for this evening.
Hi, everyone. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I think we're going to have a really great discussion tonight. We have a great panel of experts to talk all about resistance. So to kick it off, I just want our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump in to really dig into this topic tonight, resistance in context. So I'll just hand it off to them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get going.
Good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Butler, and I represent the United States. That's how I used to start my opening statements. I was a prosecutor in the District of Columbia. I represented the government in criminal court, and I used that power to put black men in prison and black women, poor people, Latino people. Like a lot of prosecutors, that was pretty much all I did. During the time that I did that work, I learned some things, including about resistance. And so I'm happy to have that conversation with you tonight.
Hi, I'm Sheila Dektor, and I have just retired from JALSA, Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action. JALSA is a social justice group in the Jewish community working on universal issues of concern. It's one now of about 35 groups around the country, mostly in urban communities, all of which are designed to bring together people in our community with people in other communities to work on the issues we all care about. Affordable housing, criminal justice, health care, did I say affordable housing? The whole panoply of social justice items that have to work right, whether it's the problems in education or the problems on the streets. All of us have our futures tied to how well we provide opportunity for all and deal with all these. And there has been this explosion of groups around the country that say we care about these things and we're working on them.
I'm John Stauffer. I'm Kate's professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard. And most of my teaching and writing has been on resistance. Most of my work is on anti-slavery abolitionism or protest literature. I've written extensively on Frederick Douglass, as well as numerous other black and white abolitionists, James McCune Smith, the foremost black intellectual before Du Bois, John Brown, Charles Sumner, and they are the black and white abolitionists. They're the first civil rights movement, the first human rights movement. They were experts, in a sense, in resistance. I've also teach a big lecture course in which I connect, it's called How and Why We're Still Fighting the Civil War, in which I connect things that are happening today, particularly with the rise of Trump's America, and how they resonate so profoundly with the larger Civil War era.
All right. So we have a former prosecutor turned criminal law professor. We have a retired director of a social justice organization, and a professor who writes literature on resistance. So I feel like we have a history of resistance. So I feel like we have our bases covered. So the first question I want to ask you all is, what exactly is resistance, and what does that mean in the context of each of your individual work?
So resistance is to take a stand on something that, in the context of what I've studied, take a stand on something that is a violation of basic human rights. Now that's a narrower definition of resistance, and when I say take a stand, it means asserting one's voice, and that can manifest itself in formal mobilization, so that anti-slavery advocates and abolitionists created organizations in which they disseminated an understanding of the importance of equality before the law, emphasizing that's the central theme that was at the center of the United States founding. And for Christians, and within the Judeo-Christian framework, what most people in the 19th century understood as a central Judeo-Christian framework. God is no respecter of persons. God, in meaning for most people, that in God's eyes all humans are equal. And that is also constitutes a form of resistance, and it can manifest itself in many different forms. In terms of the easiest way to characterize it is articulating a voice and mobilizing, and that voice can manifest itself in multiple ways. And in the abolition movement, not just in the United States, but in New World history, was a willed achievement among individuals that overthrew slavery in New World society. So in 1770, there wasn't an acre of land anywhere in North Central or South America that was free from slavery. By 1886, the entire New World had abolished slavery, and throughout Europe, slavery had been abolished and serfdom had been abolished. That was because of the efforts of individuals mobilizing, resisting, and acquiring a voice, and defeating essentially the wealthy elites, corporations of their day. In the United States, the 1% of the antebellum period were the 93,000 Americans who owned 10 or more slaves. Constituted 0.4% of the population, and they were the true 1% of their day. That was, in a sense, the enemy. That was what the abolitionists and the anti-slavery advocates were up against. That's one specific form of resistance that ultimately succeeded. And I'll just say one other thing, then pass on. In resistance, as a resistor, one of the common denominator is that individuals and groups and organizations need patience. Because one never knows when one's voice, when one's actions will have an effect. It's something we can't control. But being able to articulate the voice, your voice, disseminate it, that itself is a major source of power.
So in my work, resistance can take many forms, and I sometimes think of it just as response. The response can be developing coalitions to deal with something that absolutely needs a community-wide effort. What you're seeing, for example, those of you from this area are seeing a very large coalition called Raise Up, which is dealing with the economic injustice issues. Now, clearly, the huge gap between the 1% and everyone else is not going to be solved with one or two pieces of legislation or mechanisms. But Raise Up has brought together 110 groups working on piece by piece that might make a difference. So within the last 4 years, there was a raise in the minimum wage in Massachusetts. There was a passage of something called earned sick time. Both of these were dealing with issues of great concern for those who are earning the least income. And this at the current time, Raise Up has 3 issues. Again, raising the minimum wage, this time it's called the Fight for 15, to try to get a minimum wage of $15 an hour. We're trying to get paid medical and family and medical leave, because it's not right that families should have to make people should have to make a decision about whether to stay home with a sick child or a sick parent or not have a salary and food on the table that week. These are not choices people should have to make. And the third part of the Raise Up agenda this year is the what's called the fair tax, or the millionaire's tax, which will be on the ballot in 2018, to say that millionaires in Massachusetts should be paying a fairer share of their wealth on taxes, because we do not have a graduated income tax in Massachusetts. But it can range. It can range from a piece of legislation to groups putting themselves and their organizations in some legal danger. If you look at the sanctuary movement, for example, dealing with immigrants, you have individual churches and synagogues and mosques, and you have cities who are putting themselves out there saying, it may be that now we'll be in the crosshairs of the current administration, but we need to take a stand. We need to respond.
So the question of resistance, next, what is it that needs to be resisted? And in my work focusing on the criminal justice process, there are different theories about what the problem is, and so where the resistance comes in. So I think the liberal perspective from the Obama administration and from the traditional civil rights organizations is that the problem is about a relationship between communities of color and police. And the fix is to repair that relationship, almost like a personal relationship, to allow the groups to understand each other better. And so their resistance takes the form of reform. And you've heard a lot about body cameras, about civilian review boards when police mess up, independent prosecutors rather than having the local DA who works with the cops investigate those cases. So that's a way of thinking about resistance. What the Movement for Black Lives recommends is transformation, abolition, and their diagnosis is different. So the movement sees the problems of the criminal justice process. How many people get locked up? How brutal policing is, how wretched prisons are, as a symptom of a larger problem. The larger problem is white supremacy. And so then the question is, how can that be resisted? And does it work? And it's something that I think about a lot in my work as a legal scholar. So for a lot of our history, the way that African Americans have fought for racial uplift, I think could be framed as a story about resistance. But it's resistance to law. It's resistance to the law that authorized slavery, resistance to the law that authorized the old Jim Crow, and now resistance to the law that authorizes the new Jim Crow. So not resistance to the idea or concept of law, but resistance to the way that it's practiced in the United States, which is seen as being about, in part, the subordination of black people, not the only thing. And so people in the movement, I think, will push back a little bit against the celebratory story that you told. I know you didn't mean it only that way, that what the black experience has been in the United States has been a kind of uplift from slavery to freedom, from Jim Crow to Barack Obama. Black people are not doing well in the United States, so that's evident, I think, to a lot of people from the police videos. But in every specter of American life, the average net worth of an African-American woman is $100. $100. If you're a black man who does not have a high school degree, you're in your 40s, you're more likely to be in prison than you are to have a job. And so when we look at whether resistance has worked, especially thinking about those traditional means, I think for African-American people, it has not worked very well.
That's really interesting. So this, on your last point, it makes me think about, one of the things I find very interesting when you're talking about Black Lives Matter and some of the other protest movements that we see that involved black people in particular and people of color is this idea that there is an appropriate way to go about it. And so I'm curious, and that's part of the criticism is, why are you closing down the highway? I need to get to work. Why are you kneeling or sitting down during the national anthem? And so I find that very interesting because one of the things you mentioned was that things still aren't great for black people in this country. And so I find it interesting that when there is a movement that has started to address some of those things, that now it's almost sort of being policed in a different way in terms of respectability and what's appropriate. So I'm wondering, what is, if anything, the appropriate way to protest, to resist? Is there an appropriate way, and how do you address that?
Completely agree with you about the declension that has been happening in the. So I'll talk about the abolition movement, which is a movement not just to end slavery, but a movement to end racism and a movement to try to overcome white supremacy. And by the end of the Civil War, particularly with the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, which guarantees by law all equal protection under the law for all people, citizenship for everyone born in the United States, and suffrage for half of the former slaves. The transformation was extraordinary. And then immediately, not immediately, but a counter-revolution. I mean, that was a true social revolution followed by a counter-revolution because whites want to try to return their vision of a nation to essentially a white nation or white man's nation. So there's constant battle. And so African Americans could, especially black men, could be very euphoric almost, or thrilled by the end of the Civil War. with citizenship, and they, in southern communities and northern communities, they were now leaders in their communities until the counter-revolution kicks in. And then with the counter-revolution, there is this profound decline. So the abolitionist, someone like Frederick Douglass, who is in 1865, 1866, believes that the United States is finally beginning to fulfill its ideals 20 years later. And he's representative. 20 years later, by 1886. It's like I feel like I'm starting this battle all over again. And in a sense, in the 20th century, it's been similar. Following the civil rights, the successes of the civil rights movement in the 64, 65, and the efforts to alleviate poverty, since, depending on the statistics that we have, whether it's Nixon or Reagan, there has been a counter-revolution that's been in place. And you're absolutely right that most African Americans are really suffering in ways. The declension has been profound, and which highlights for activists in this question of resistance the sense that one has to be open to new possibilities, to new strategies. In the civil rights movement in the 20th century and the civil rights movement in the 19th century, the original success came through achieving an entree into the political party. The rise of first the Liberty Party, and then the Free Soil Party, and then the Republican Party, which is they're all the central platform is an anti-slavery platform, a party whose mission is to abolish slavery. That becomes transformative. Even though when the Liberty Party starts, there are 7,000 votes for Liberty Party members in 1840. And then finally Lincoln is elected in 1860, 20 years later, and simply because he's elected, Southerners secede. And African Americans and radicals also, they transformed the Democratic Party in the 1960s in ways that are profound. That became effective. But it's not always effective.
So I want to respond to the particular part of your question that dealt with strategies. I have found on a variety of issues that we've dealt with over the years that the strategies often vary with a specific group, subgroup if you will, having to be more aggressive, more assertive, and being out there and at first kind of getting the wrath of other groups around them, that they're going to lose part of the coalition, or they aren't being sufficiently respectable, or they're waiting, they got to wait and be more patient and what have you. I just want to give two very different examples. In the Jewish community in the 80s and the 90s, a whole lot of attention was paid on trying to help Soviet Jews get out of the Soviet Union. They were not allowed to practice their religion, and it became a major effort by Jewish groups in a variety of countries to try to help the Soviet Jews get out. And a group called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry began doing things that were much more chancy, if you will. They would go, they could get in and visit the Soviet Union, but they would go to parts of the Soviet Union that they were not supposed to go to. They would take trains. They would have in their luggage dungarees, small electronics that could be sold. The electronics at that time, a Nintendo game could be sold for a great deal of money and help a refusnik exist. A refusnik was someone who was fired from their job because they were Jews and they were no longer able to teach in the university or to otherwise carry out their occupation, and so had no money to live on. And so these groups would try to smuggle in things for them to sell and be able to live. And slowly but surely, the main the kind of establishment groups began to decide, well, maybe they weren't really being active enough and aggressive enough, and began to develop some of those same techniques. The other response that I want to talk about is in terms of the AIDS epidemic. So if you can remember, it was ACT UP with its much more aggressive means of dealing, sit-ins, lie-ins, just in-your-face kind of resistance to try to say that the Reagan administration was just not doing enough. In fact, whatever they were doing was wrong, and to try to make sure the rest of us understood what this epidemic was about. And so I think looking back at the history of some of this and the changes, it might give us some help in trying to understand some of the different strategies right now that from a distance, and particularly when people are looking at a group that isn't their own or an issue that is not their central core issue, seems like too aggressive a response.
So in the fight for African American liberation, both historically and now, I want to think about three different forms of resistance: law, violence, and capitalism. Law hasn't worked very well. It's against the law to discriminate against black people in most markets. African American people experience discrimination in every single market that we participate in. So what the law has done is stigmatize some forms of discrimination, but it's barely blunted its effect. Violence. If we think about the kind of central heroic story in African American liberation, it's the journey from slavery to freedom. So that was accomplished by violence, and not just any violence, but the most brutal, bloody war in our history. And if the goal was to end slavery, well, that's what did it. It worked. In the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Martin Luther King was famously anti-violent. In the Black Power movement, a more urban-focused movement, there was a conversation about the utility of violence, and certainly that was always lurking in the background, often framed as self-defense, understanding how violent white supremacy is, and thinking of using violence in response as a way of fighting back. And in the movement for Black Lives, sometimes violence has been effective. So if we think about if violence means throwing things at a CVS, it was effective in Ferguson or in Baltimore, I think, in terms of getting the Department of Justice to intervene quicker, and in Baltimore, getting those police officers prosecuted. In terms of a strategy, I think violence against people at this moment, if attempted by African Americans, would be ineffective. So in just war doctrine, when folks try to think about, is it ever appropriate to go to war? Writ large, is it ever appropriate to use violence to try to achieve an end? Sometimes it might be, some of that jurisprudence suggests, but if it's not going to work, then it's inappropriate. And I think as a strategy for racial uplift for black people, violence wouldn't work. Black people would be crushed if that was the strategy. So at the end of the day, I don't think that's the most effective. And finally, consistent theme in racial discourse is about capitalism. If black people owned our own businesses, the theory goes, then we wouldn't have to worry about not being served or not being treated well in white establishments. So again, a very consistent theme here, black people. African Americans are often unfavorably contrasted with people like Asian Americans or black immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa. The idea is those folks also experience extreme discrimination. They're victims of white supremacy, but they don't worry about civil rights. They worry about owning their own stuff. And that is seen as somehow blunting the effects of white supremacy. Again, traditional up until this moment. So Beyonce, her video for Formation, a song where she portrays the racial and gender situation in dire terms. She tells black women, if you don't form coalitions, you will be eliminated. That's what this moment is about. But her recommendation, at the end she says, best revenge is your papers. Papers is money. And another part she says that she might be the next Bill Gates in the making. So again, a real strong theme in black political discourse, that the way to resist is to be better at playing the capitalist game than other people are.
So, Paul, that's a really interesting point. And I guess my follow-up question, too, is, I mean, we know, though, or don't we know, historically, and even in, modern times, that when certain groups do try to advance, have their own businesses, that there is a pushback that they face as well, and even just trying to achieve those sort of economic gains. So how do you address that? Whether it's housing, whether it's getting a license to open a business, getting a loan to open a business. We know that that's also something, there's also a resistance to that, to whether it's the African American community or other communities, when they're trying to build that wealth for themselves, for their communities, that there is still a struggle, there's still a barrier.
So in my new book, Chokehold, Policing Black Men, the idea is that the system is working the way it's supposed to. And so when we think about, well, why is it that African Americans aren't achieving at the same rate in certain sectors as Asian Americans or white folks? Why are there so many black men in prison? Why do so many African American women get evicted? So that's how it's supposed to work. Those aren't flaws. Those are integral features of the system. And so if we're thinking about what must be resisted in order for African Americans to live as freely as white folks, I think we have to think about the identity of the United States. So this is Ta-Nehisi Coates' idea that there's something about white supremacy that's embedded in our national identity. And as long as we have this form of government, then African Americans will continue to suffer these forms of deprivation. And so then the idea is that the vision has to be larger than reform. It has to be about transformation. President Obama addressed this, and what I think his best speech was. It was at the 50th anniversary of Selma, which was another example of police officers wilding out against black folks and other protesters, beating them up. And President Obama, in commemorating that 50th anniversary, was responding to two kinds of things that were out there in the political world. Rudy Giuliani had said that he thought that Obama didn't love America. And Ta-Nehisi Coates had made the point that I just made, that there's something about subordinating black people that's an integral feature of what it means to be the United States. So Obama, responding to both, talked about what those folks did at Selma. They got beat up, but they were resisting, and they were resisting law. So to Giuliani, he said, resisting is kind of an American thing. And not just for black folks, but for everybody. That's what we do. That's what formed us as a nation. We resist unfair law. And so when these black folks marched at Selma, in a sense, they were uber Americans. That's what black people are, according to Obama, because we're the first and the most vocal about resisting. And to Ta-Nehisi Coates, he said that in resisting, what they did was remake the United States. And that's what we have to keep doing, Obama suggested. We have to remake the United States. And so, again, in this form of government, with this form of law, I don't think that there's a lot of room for optimism. So I think what resistance is about is transforming this form of government, this rule of law, to something that's more just.
Completely agree. I think that's very, very well said, beautifully said. Beautifully said. And there are examples, and it's also very true that once African Americans in particular have tried to take advantage of the capitalist system, and there is pushback. There have been examples of mobilization and of transformation, both geographically, that then leads to political and legal transformation. So the Great Migration is one of the most transformative events in American history. In 1917, on the eve of the beginning of the Great Migration, 95% of African Americans were still living in former Confederate states. And it was a leaderless revolution, both to escape the profound racism, but also to be able to take advantage of a capitalist system. And there were really three migrations. Isabel Wilkerson has brilliantly described this, migrations of African Americans in the Southeast going up to the East Coast, in the Mississippi and Alabama up to the Midwestern, and then Texas and Louisiana going up to the West. And by the end, it was a crucial catalyst for the civil rights movement. It transforms the United States, and it leads to the rise in wealth of African Americans in a way that that was unprecedented. And then, because of the nature of American democracy, there is, I call it a counter-revolution, which then needs in new forms of transformation. Completely agree with you. So stasis, fixity is bad for African Americans and other minority groups because of the need, given the system, to continually transform.
So I'd like to look at a meeting that's happening this evening and kind of place it in the conversation of the last two comments. There's a meeting in City Hall tonight with Boston Properties, and the issue some of you saw in today's newspaper. It has to do with the building of a rather substantial luxury apartment building on Boylston Street, and the newspaper described the question of the shadows on the churches and the implications of that. I was at a meeting within the last couple of weeks of the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, which is an organization that's working on criminal justice, it's working on affordable housing, and they were talking about how the discussion had gone in trying to hold the developers, who stand to make a whole lot of money on this huge skyscraper, on the fact that this building was being planned during the period of an election in Boston. And I sat there almost bewildered. I was in a room filled with organizers, representatives of a whole lot of different synagogues and churches and mosques who are joining together because they're trying to reach goals of improving some of the things we're talking about tonight. But I was like sitting there going, why isn't this the subject of resistance during the election? If there's an election going on right now, why are they not holding the current mayor to task during this election process to try to use some power to get a better situation? I don't necessarily. Whether the issue is like stopping the building or just making sure that the developers were giving more money to those impacted, but it just seemed to me this huge wasted opportunity for allowing an election to go by and not using the power of all these groups to demand change. And so I would just say that our recognition of times when we do have power, when we can bring power to bear, and can try to push for change, are sometimes neglected.
So we're talking about resistance in context. So I want to talk about today's context. What do you see today that needs to be resisted, and how do you go about it?
A lot of things need to be resisted. I'll start with Trump. I too am feel that Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing sheds immense light on our contemporary moment. He is, in my view, he's acknowledged the influence of James Baldwin and other African American writers, and I think his insights, he's penetrating and subtle and brilliant in terms of unpacking and illuminating and exposing the present moment. And one of the things that he said in his Atlantic pieces is that Trump is the response to Obama. And he is a white supremacist. His election stemmed in part because he helped found the birther movement. And the birther movement there's a long-standing tradition. It's taken different forms for most of American history and culture. One didn't have to be as oblique. They could just say that a black leader needs to be taken off his or her pedestal. And for Trump, it was that he could no longer say that Obama was illegitimate as president simply because he was black, which had been some people could say that for over a century. Now it's because they had to make up a different excuse. Much like with the rise of mass incarceration, with the rise of Reagan's America, states' rights becomes the euphemism for white supremacy. Lee Atwater, who is a Mississippian, who was a major advisor to Reagan, explicitly told Reagan this. You can no longer openly acknowledge your white supremacy. You now have to use different terms. States' rights. Reagan becomes a major states' rights person. He opens the way for mass incarceration. So where do we go? I think I'm unsure in terms of what to do in this current climate other than continue to fight against the current administration, do everything in our collective power to ensure that the Trump administration is not reelected and leaves power as soon as possible. I think that's very important. How to do that, I'm not entirely sure. Every day there are new surprises. So it's I think a very unusual period. It's sometimes hard to use the past as a framework for helping us understand where we are today, because of what's happening. But certainly that needs to be addressed. Also, what needs to be addressed is a new transformation. That there needs to be an awareness, and this is where Coates is so insightful. That there has to be there needs to be a new mobilization and a fundamental reconceptualization of our current notion of democracy.
I think in a number of ways there is this effort going on. I think that the kind of political activity by young people, by people who have not been involved before, is a beginning. And I think we are seeing around the country groups that are recognizing that there's like multiple levels for their resistance. One is clearly to continue the resistance to Trump, whether it is through the courts, which has slowed down a number of his efforts quite a bit, but not all. These changes in regulations have not been stopped, although in part because he's ignored the regular regulatory process in how long things are announced and how much time people have to respond to them. He's just some of this above and beyond the law, ignoring the law, and some of it just doing things as absolutely quickly as they can. But there are people trying to take him to task at the federal level, but also a kind of a recognition that some of the change needs to occur at the local level. The systemic changes in policing are needed at all levels, and although some of what's happening at almost everything that's happening at the Justice Department is dreadful and is putting us back decades. There are ways to continue to fight locally, and have to be done. The prospect, for example, the proposals at the federal government there's already law that says you cannot use federal funds for abortion, but there were ways for people on Medicaid to have access to health care. Here in Massachusetts, we've gone to the State House and to pass legislation to make sure that if the federal legislation passes, which further decimates Medicare and Medicaid, that we have some state language in place ready to protect those things. Nothing is happening with gun violence at the federal level. So at the state level, there are still some efforts to try to say that certain kinds of weapons just do not belong here. So clearly, I see Trump as a key, but he's not the. It's not like Trump's election came on a democratic system that was already working with great economic justice to begin with. So we have plenty of opportunities to resist and work locally.
And I think that's the point. So when I think about what must be resisted and how it should be resisted, I don't think that my comments are different now than they would have been had Hillary Clinton been elected, or what I would have said during the Obama administration. So what is it that has to be resisted at this moment? To think about that, I'll ask you. So just a quick story about Eric Garner. My book is Chokehold, as I've mentioned. The title is in part inspired by what happened to him in Staten Island, where the police were arresting him allegedly because he was selling Lucy cigarettes, a tobacco cigarette. And when the police officer perceived that Mr. Garner was resisting arrest, he put him in an illegal chokehold, which killed him. So, what was going on there? First of all, Mr. Garner did sell Lucy cigarettes at this park across from the Staten Island ferry. He'd done that for a long time. As it happens, he wasn't doing it that day, so that was a false arrest. But he and the officer had a history, so the officer knew he'd done that. Why were they so focused on this park at this moment? People had been selling Lucy's in there for a long time. Staten Island, right across from Manhattan. It's an island, so there's water. Expensive condo is being built across from this park. And now all of a sudden there's this intense concentration of law enforcement on this park, going after people for low-level offenses like selling tobacco cigarettes. Why is that a thing to sell Lucy cigarettes? So it's in part because New York, like the rest of the country, had a huge financial crisis. Federal and state governments spent $1 billion to rescue banks. Not one of those guys went to jail. Mayor Bloomberg says that he's not going to raise taxes, but he's got to come up with money from somewhere because this $1 billion has gone to the banks. So he selects the most regressive tax possible on cigarettes. The tax had been 6 cents a pack. It goes up to $1.50 a pack. If you're a low-income person who smokes, you can't afford it anymore, and so there's this market. Virginia doesn't tax cigarettes anywhere like New York, and so Mr. Garner and a number of other entrepreneurs do this business now, where they drive trucks from Virginia to New York and sell the Lucy cigarettes there. So again, that's why he's doing it, because it's a function of a kind of political economy, right? A racial political economy. And the last part of that story, again, I'm asking you, what does this story tell us about what needs to be resisted? The reason why we know what happened to Mr. Garner is because a man named Mr. Orta took the videotape. That night, after the videotape had gone viral, the NYPD rolls up to Mr. Orta's house, and the police car shines a spotlight on his window. "We're coming for you," is how he takes that. And Mr. Orta doesn't help his case by continuing to sometimes do illegal stuff like sell drugs. And he starts getting arrested when he's done illegal stuff and when he hasn't. And at one point, the police officers execute a search warrant at his house. And the weird thing is they bring a camera and they film everything. And that film, they end up arresting his mom. And that film makes its way to the New York Daily News. And the question is, well, why were you guys filming this? The response from the police is, well, he got his film, now we got ours. They made a deal with Mr. Orta: if you plead guilty, we're not going to lock your mother up. So Mr. Orta is now doing 4 years in prison. His crime is filming truth to power. So if that's how the system works, what does that tell us about what needs to be resisted? I think we're talking about a political economy here of white supremacy. That's a lot about race, and that's also about class. And I guess the last thing is what are our roles? What's your role? So when we think about other struggles for racial justice, sometimes I like to think what I would have done, like during slavery. I hope I would have been a runaway. I hope I would have led one of those uprisings. But the reality is most people, including most enslaved people, didn't do that. During the civil rights movement, I hope that I would have been one of the people who sat at the counters, the lunch counters, one of those folks who took it to the streets with Malcolm. Reality is most folks didn't do that. In the movement for Black Lives, there's an expression: if you wonder what you would have done back in the day, ask yourself, what are you doing right now? Because this movement is one of the central human rights and civil rights issues of our time. And I think that's a vital question.
That's a really strong point. You mentioned the videotape in the Eric Garner case, and I cover business and tech at WBUR. So one of the things I'm really fascinated by is how technology is changing everything. And we're seeing that in these resistance movements. Hashtags, people gathering online, people sharing information online. We're seeing so many videotapes these days of police shootings. How has technology changed resistance, and do you think the use of technology now, how people are using it, is a good thing? Is it helping the resistance movements that we see?
I think it depends on the kind of technology, so I can speak in particular to the camera. It is true that with the rise of Black Lives Matters, increasingly many African Americans have concluded they won't leave home without a camera. Because even though everyone in theory recognizes that a camera, whether it's a still photograph or film, can lie, can distort, then in practice it still tells the truth. And so by documenting what happens, then uploading it, that has raised consciousness and exposed issues of human rights and civil rights abuses. And there's a direct relationship, a direct line between the increasing use of cameras on social media today and the invention of photography in the 19th century and the use of it by black and white abolitionists. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American in the 19th century. He wrote more extensively on photography than any other American. He recognized how crucial it was as a abolition, civil rights, human rights medium, because it told the truth. And so I think that can be it's shown, I think it can be very, very powerful. It depends on how it's contextualized, but within Black Lives Matters, I think they've been very effective specifically at using cameras. And that's been a source of hope.
I think there are two sides here, or 2 points. I think that social media has become a great resource for getting the message out and being able to show the videos and to get people out to rallies and things like that, so that when things go viral, it's a great form of communication. But I worry about a different aspect of it, and that is there is a certain distance that occurs because of social media and the use of phones. I think that in some ways participation and passion and real concern are somewhat dependent on first-hand relationships. And I sometimes worry, at least in the organizing area, that if we think we can replace the role of understanding each other and working together and having some knowledge about each other's passion and where it comes from and why they're involved in these fights, I think there will be a loss. And so we're forever trying to figure out how to make sure that we still have ways to grow relationships among people who are working on these things.
All right. So with that, I think we want to open it up for audience questions. So if anyone has a question for our panelists, yeah, there's a hand here.
Thank you very much for this very good conversation that we're having. And I'm very interested in the Civil War also, because I visited a battlefield for the first time this summer and realized I didn't know anything about the Civil War, and I don't think people do know much about it anymore, except for scholars such as yourself, Professor. But something that hasn't come up in the conversation thus far is the role of labor, the resistance of that we see in the 19th century, throughout the 19th century, to oppression of employer to the employed, the Industrial Revolution. Then after the Civil War, literally an explosion in labor relations and drive to unionize, and the first free speech movement was the Wobblies and that type of thing. And then today, it just seems like labor has kind of ceded most of, if they get to sit at the table with a Democrat, that's it. If they have a breakfast, that's it. But we don't see militant tactics the way that we saw back in the 30s, which was a great epoch of civil rights. And I feel like we're getting ready to roll over for the Democrats again to get Trump out. But what we don't have in this country, and it's been often remarked, is a labor party, a party for working people, a party for ordinary people with ordinary needs, universal ordinary needs. Nor do we have any economic democracy in this country, because we don't have ordinary people saying we need these resources, so we're putting them in. And we don't have really in our political democracy, we don't seem to have grassroots democracy anymore. We have things coming down from on high. We have seen a counter movement against that in the last election. And I feel like we need a party for a new, we don't need a duopoly anymore. It's not sports, it's not a sports competition. One side's in, the other side's out and goes to the Kennedy School. We don't need that. What we need is a party where people have a voice, a democratic voice, and take votes. And from the grassroots on up. And I'd like to hear that addressed.
Yes, I think that's a question for you, John.
You're absolutely right. It's a great point. So, and when you mentioned the Wobblies, for those of you who don't know, the Industrial Workers of the World was the most radical and effective labor movement from the 1880s really until 1917, when Woodrow Wilson passes the Espionage Act, which silences them. And then and rounds up 200 or so of the leading Wobblies and throws them in jail. And the Wobblies was also it was a thoroughly integrated, it was the most integrated labor movement in American history. For those of you who don't know, it was about an equal voice and an equal vote, regardless of who you were. It was a time in which most Americans, most poor Americans in particular, whether you were white or black or a foreigner, you could not vote because most states had laws stating that you had to live in the state for at least a year. And so many poor Americans were migrants, moving around looking for jobs. And the Wobblies, they recognized that the democratic political process was bankrupt. For roughly 20 years or so, they were united with the Socialist Party. So the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, I mean, he at one point received 20 million votes, but he's still a far cry from getting elected, whereas the Wobblies are a grassroots movement. It's direct action at the point of production. And their strikes led to huge increases in wages, and it was effective. They're then thrown, basically the movement is just destroyed because of the Espionage Act. And then the Communist Party USA becomes the vanguard of the radical labor movement. And that actually influences the AFL-CIO during FDR's reign. And then there is a stripping away. I was actually cautiously optimistic during the Occupy movement, because the Occupy movement reminded me of the kind of anarchic, wobbly vision of direct action at the point of production, whether it's right next to Wall Street or in many different cities. And that,
it's not just a wobbly view; it's a socialist and a Marxist.
Yeah, socialist and a Marxist, yes. But best as an organization, you're absolutely right. I'm just referring to as wobbly, and that's why the socialists and Wobblies were joined at the hip, so to speak. But that is that's a major issue. I mean, we've talked about how class and race, they have they've functioned together. The interrelationship between class and race is so important. And what has been, there has been very little done in terms of trying to recover the kind of welfare state that had been in place from the 30s through roughly the 70s. And in fact, with FDR's second term coincided with African Americans for the first time. Most African Americans voted for FDR in the second term, because he was willing to allow African Americans to participate in some of his New Deal efforts, even though he had to keep the Dixiecrats So he couldn't give them what whites had, but he could give them something. And that started this slow engine of profound transformation at the federal level. And so how do we bring this back? That's a great question.
I think there's some questions.
Oh, there's
otherwise-
more questions, yeah,
Just some commentary, respond how you want, but, well, first of all, Lincoln wasn't anti-slavery, he's pro-wage systems.
Yeah, Lincoln was profoundly anti-slavery. Profoundly in fact, when Lincoln ran for president, he made it very clear.
But he
that-
didn't want the African Americans to stay in America after they were,
So he was a colonizationist, but he was a colonization. But so Illinois was one of the more racist Midwestern states, and Lincoln is first and foremost a politician. And so had Lincoln come out as an abolitionist, it would have been political suicide in Illinois.
Then some other impressions with the idea of violence, which really just scares me in general. Because you can't, once violence starts, you can't tell who foe or friend is. And once it starts, it hits everybody. And I understand that given the Jewish community was nearly annihilated, there's only 2 to 3 million, if I'm not mistaken, in the United States with the programs and the Holocaust, and they didn't resist as much, much. But again, violence is just a scary thought. And I belong to a lot of resistance groups, but the day Trump was elected, I wanted to go down into the basement and grab every chemical and make a Molotov cocktail. And but again, I don't want to be painted, and this is probably a white thing, I don't want to be painted as a radical, baby boomer who is blowing up labs and will never be taken seriously. And I think that kind of falls, because I'm in a position, it falls onto other people, if I don't accept violence, then when you see someone like Colin, I'm saying his name wrong, but kneeling, it's like, oh, that's great. He's not acting violently, where, it's like the system of control. And then lastly, I don't think that the relationship between blacks and cops can be resolved until someone addresses the PTSD among the groups. But I see cops as militants who can't connect to a community because they've been so militarized that they're no longer human. But at the same time, you have African Americans who, since slavery was enacted, the family unit of the African community was torn apart, and that it's just this, long PTSD that was this trauma that was never resolved. So maybe and whatever.
So you talked about a fear about starting violence. So violence is going on right now. So when we look at what happens to Native people, what happens to immigrants, what happens to African American people, that's violent. And so the question is, what we've been talking about, how to resist. And the way that Black revolutionaries have consistently framed their use of violence is as self-defense. And so then the question to ask is, well, would it work? Would it be effective? And there, my answer is no. So I think at the end of the day, we might agree about the morality of violence or the immorality of it, especially if it's directed against people, as opposed to the CVS, which I feel differently about. But if it's people, there's a moral conversation to have, but there's also an instrumental conversation to have. And again, I think instrumentally, it's not going to work. And so that's a reason, in addition to the moral issue, of why I take it off the table. And remind me quickly what your second concern was.
This idea of blacks and cops both suffering from PTSD because they've both been ripped apart from their humanity, where the black family has been decimated through slavery, and then cops have been militarized. I mean, they're like robots.
Yeah. So I certainly agree with you about police, that there's a culture that President Obama described as a warrior mentality. And so his reform-minded fix was to transform the culture into a guardian mentality. And I think that, there's some slight promise there. I do think we have to, there's always a tension between reform and transformation, between liberal solutions and radical solutions. It's easiest to understand with regard to the death penalty. A lot of us want to abolish the death penalty. There's a school of people who work on, since we have it, making it fairer so that we don't put children to death. We don't execute people who are mentally disabled. But you get that tension right. If we're making it better and fairer, then that might be prolonging the day that abolition comes. With regard to the police, it's the same thing. Maybe we could make them beat us up a little bit less, kill us a little bit less, arrest fewer black people in situations in which they wouldn't arrest white people. But at the end of the day, I think as long as we have this criminal process that says that it's the state that decides and state actors that decide who's the most dangerous and who's the most immoral, and then figures out a way to punish, that's always going to be about race and class. So we have to think about ways of being safe and making people take responsibility when they've hurt others that don't involve so much police and prosecution. And again, with regard to whether black folks suffer from trauma, I think the answer is absolutely. How could we not? But in terms of the impact, it's almost an empirical claim, right? So if we look at the evidence about what the impact of trauma is, African Americans have a version of this conversation where we ask, well, what if white folks had to go through what we go through? And we usually say, you guys would be crazy. You just couldn't deal with what we deal with. And there's some actually good social science that supports that. So real quickly, there's this thing called the racial invariance theory. And that asks, does a factor, say, not graduating from high school, does it have a different impact according to your race? And when people do that research with regard to who's at risk for committing a crime, it's hard to find similarly situated blacks and whites in terms of class, because poor white people are more like middle-class black people. But when you can find that white guy who suffers the same kind of deprivation as a black guy, guess what? He's more likely to commit a crime. So to me, as much as we want to demonize black masculinity, I know that's not what you were doing, but to the extent that we have these ideas about damage in the African American community, survival is an act of resistance. And the fact that, that black folks are still here, and again, this research that suggests that there's something actually redemptive about black masculinity for all the ways that we want to demonize it. What that evidence shows us is that it prevents black men from committing a crime when a similarly situated white person would. And so trauma, absolutely. But there's something that's not redemptive about resistance, because that makes it too romantic. It'd be way better if we didn't have to resist. But appreciating the strength, right, that comes from resistance.
All right, I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. You had your hand up, sir. Yeah.
So it strikes me that we're sort of surrounded with this ocean of ignorance, and it's expressing itself as misogyny, as racism, as discrimination against various sexual orientations. And all of these things have groups that are advocating on behalf of addressing those concerns. So I'd like to hear from the panel as to whether you feel that those groups are aligned and working together, or competing with one another for the attention of the public and of resources. And then, as a follow-up, I'd also like to ask, this is very informative and also profoundly depressing. I think, as Einstein said, the sure sign of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we've seen with the Occupy movement, with the Civil Rights movement, we've done these things over and over again as a culture, but there hasn't been radical change. At least that's how it feels right now. Maybe it's just because we're surrounded with, a racist in chief and an attorney general who is a white supremacist. So, 2 questions. Thank you.
Let's just take one more question and we'll wrap it up. If you have your hand up, sir, do you have a question to add for our panel?
Yes, I have a comment, and That's the question. Women. That's my comment and that's my question. That the women's march that I took part in Boston and what I heard about, other major cities in the United States and around the world was so significant. And how is that power that came out in that kind of a march and that kind of a feeling that was there? It was a feeling of unity of people, ages, classes, ethnicities, races, all work together. And why was that so effective? I know I felt it very deeply. And I wondered whether the panel would like to comment on the women's movement and what that has done. Thank you.
So we had a question about the women's march, the women's
Right,
movement,
and
then
whether the
about
groups are working
what-
together.
Yeah.
So, I would say that the groups are continuing to work together. That there are an amazing amount of coalitions going on, whether it's indivisible or divisible or I could show you my email, and it is like a list of all kinds of action networks. One, for example, called Rogan's List for the Day, is a list of items that can be acted upon in a given day. I was going to print out today's list to bring until I saw that it was going to be 13 pages. 13 pages of specific items, of things, of actions that people could do. And they were across the board on everything from, civil rights, environmental, efforts dealing with particular women's health and so forth. But what is it that prevents all these groups from joining together in a kind of more active, new way? Is it because each one has their own focus, which is still the center of what they're dealing with? I don't think so. I wonder if it is more toward the question that was asked over here, whether there is a kind of fright of whether or not more aggressive, violent techniques might be even worse than whatever is being faced at a given moment. I think that a lot of people are concerned. When, however, they see violence on the other side, people reacted very, very quickly to the Charlottesville and to clear pictures of Nazis walking on the street or white supremacists, whatever words you want to use. But are they willing to put their own economic livelihood, their own lives at stake to press harder? It would seem not. And I don't know what so in other words, I'm committed to the steps, the Rogan's List, all the things that can be done. I am seeing successes. I do see positive kinds of change. Do I see the transformation that Paul is talking about? No. Do I feel like it's imminent? No, but I don't know an alternative organizing other than step by step by step. I don't know.
So if I think about a social justice movement that's accomplished a lot in a relatively short time, I think about the movement for marriage equality and the movement to have the military stop discriminating against LGBT people. I guess we should say LGB people, since the military still does discriminate against transgender folks. But a lot happened in a short time. And when you ask why, as kind of a case study in a social justice movement, I think the answer is that movement, which was led by a segment of the LGBT community, mainly elite white men, it didn't form coalitions with other groups. It was relatively single-minded. It chose the most conservative institutions to integrate, the military and marriage, some of the most conservative. And it was successful in a way that does not disrupt a lot of what we're concerned about. And so if we think about intersectionality, so, they're not separate silos, so we can think about sexual orientation and race and gender. So some people are lesbian and African American and immigrants. And so there are all of those things, right? But the movement for marriage equality, I think, was single-minded and about mainly elite white men feeling like they're part of the other elite guys. And so when I think about why it's successful, again, not to demean the struggle, the effort that it took, and the benefit that has to a number of people, including folks who aren't rich white guys. I think a part of its success was its kind of single-mindedness. It's not reaching out to other groups. And that leads to your question, sir, about the Women's March and its effectiveness. So that's kind of an empirical claim as well, right? So then the question is, well, what's the evidence that it was effective? In part, well, what was it trying to do? So I think we need, the folks in this room, we need a theory of social change, right? We need to know where we want to go, and then a theory about how we get there. So I'd be more interested in hearing like what the goal of that march was. It certainly, as marches do, it makes you feel good, right? And there's, I don't want to discount that either. That's important. We come to meetings like this and we get all depressed, so we need something. Feeling good is a good thing. It gives us that spirit of resistance. But in terms of what it does for that black woman whose net worth is $100, either in the short term or the long term, again, I think we need to know more about that to determine whether it was a success.
Well, I just want to make a comment about that. The Women's March, what it did for me, it made me feel equal. It made me feel that as a man, and whatever I did in terms of women was so often wasn't so great, but it made me feel that it could be equal. And that's what it was important, that all people are equal, and all people need caring and love and wanting to be free. And that's what that march meant to me. It was very effective in that way. It made me really want that kind of life to exist. It was like the socialist goal of the past. It was now a new socialist goal to have women and their attitudes and their understanding and their oppression that they've had all their lives get together and get men as part of that too. Because the men in that march were just as much part of that march as the women. And that was very good to see.
John, did you have anything to add to the other questions before we wrap up this evening?
Go ahead, go ahead.
No, you sounded, it
So,
looked like
yeah,
you
I
had
think-
something you
yeah,
want to
so
say
I
here.
can
I'll
just
pass the
say-
mic. Yeah.
So historically, in the terms of achieving abolition and the Reconstruction Amendments and women's suffrage, the protest movements have been pretty focused. We're advocating first full suffrage during the debates over the 15th Amendment, and when that fails and it's only male, unrestricted male suffrage, and when women achieve unrestricted suffrage, it's very focused. The civil rights in the 20th century was focused both and it was a collaboration or a combination of grassroots plus efforts at the federal level. So there's been within the political system activists and members who are able to connect people at the federal level, politicians, with grassroots activists. That's important. And I should say that, yeah, things are depressing, But there has been progress in the long scheme over the in a long arc. So for African Americans, 150 years ago, the fear was slavery, chattel slavery, which itself is violence. Without violence or the threat of violence, slavery cannot exist. So it's why virtually every single black abolitionist was not opposed to using violence, because slavery itself is violence. And the most pacifist groups during the Civil War realized they had to make a decision between the violence of slavery that affected 4 million people or the violence of war. What's the lesser of two evils? Embrace the war to vanquish the violence of slavery. And that becomes important. And without the Reconstruction Amendments, the nation today would be far worse off than it is right now. It doesn't mean that we have a long way to go, but we could still be living in a society in which slavery was not just limited to the prison system, which is massive, and it's, as most of you know, the 13th Amendment retains slavery for people who are convicted of crimes. But until the 13th Amendment, slavery was widespread. A third of the population of the South was widespread. Or a third of the population of the South was enslaved. It was everywhere and expanding. So there have been some changes, just not a lot.
I would just, since we're wrapping up, would just like to also leave with that note. The fact that we don't have the perspective and the solutions to do it all should not prevent us from doing what we can. I was involved from very early efforts on the equal marriage here in Massachusetts, and was as surprised as anyone that in the number of years between the Goodrich court case to seeing major changes at the federal level, that it could be done in such a short time. I think that we need to still concentrate on whatever piece of injustice we see and respond to it, and to try to find ways to make any of several things better. Here in the large cities of the urban cities of Massachusetts, clearly education, public education, is still not doing the job it needs to do for young children of color, and the answer is not a simple solution of just taking them out of the public school system. Charter schools are never going to replace what the public schools need to do. So working even in terms of local schools, in terms of local communities, in terms of the issues of housing, so that people have more options available. And clearly issues of minimum wage, because it is not possible for people to develop wealth in order to buy homes if they with substandard wages. So there are a lot of things to work on that make for real change for people, and I would hate to see us go out of here depressed and not feeling there are ways to make it better.
All right. I just want to thank our panel. We're out of time. We're a little over, but I want to thank our panel. So Paul, Sheila, John, thank you so much. This is really great. All right. right, that's it. We have some snacks over there if anyone wants some.
Everybody, looking forward to